Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're looking at everyday disasters. You know, most of us look at a wall or a ceiling in our home and we just never think about what might be brewing behind the drywall. But water damage, it is incredibly destructive, it's super expensive, and honestly, it is surprisingly scientific. So we're going to literally peel back the drywall today and look at the fascinating hidden science of structural drawing.
So I want to pose a question to you right off the bat. What exactly happens the second a pipe bursts inside your walls? Or think about this, when an appliance slowly leaks for a whole month without you even noticing. It's really not just a simple puddle that you can easily mop up. An invisible, incredibly destructive chain reaction begins with that very first drop of water. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, the perfect storm in Carmichael. Second, the 48-hour ticking clock. Third, the 3 categories of water. Fourth, the science of psychometrics. And finally, the professional restoration process. Basically, we're following the literal life cycle of a water disaster, straight from the cause all the way to the scientific cure.
Starting off with Section 1, the perfect storm in Carmichael, geography, weather, and aging infrastructure. Carmichael, California actually provides a fascinating real-world laboratory for water damage.
Carmichael faces these really intense, year-round threats from both its environment and its own mid-century architecture. First off, the geography itself is a huge threat. The clay soil throughout Carmichael literally expands when it gets wet and shrinks when it dries. This constant back-and-forth movement cracks slab foundations and puts massive stress on plumbing connections. Then, you've got the winter atmospheric rivers that dump just heavy rain, completely overwhelming drainage systems and flooding out crawl spaces. But hey, summer brings its own headaches. In that 100-degree heat, AC units are working overtime, and those drain lines? They absolutely love to clog with algae, backing water right down into your ceiling, usually right when you're hosting a dinner party, right? And tying this whole shebang together is the aging housing stock, packed with 1950s and 60s plumbing.
Just read this quote, "Homes built before 1970 contain galvanized steel pipes that corrode from mineral deposits in Sacramento's hard water, rupturing without warning. These pipes might look totally fine from the outside, but internally, they are just filling up with rust. They restrict the water flow, they build up this massive pressure, and then bam, they just burst. It is an invisible crisis brewing right behind the drywall, dumping something like 10 to 15 gallons per minute into a living space. To put that into perspective, that's enough to fill a bathtub in just a few minutes. It's catastrophic."
Moving into Section 2, the 48-hour ticking clock. Why every minute increases the risk. Once that rupture actually happens, the absolute most critical variable enters the equation, and that's time.
48. I really want to highlight this because this is the magic number in structural drawing. A 48-hour window is quite literally all it takes for what starts out as relatively clean water to completely turn into a biological hazard.
Let's walk through this timeline together so you can see exactly how fast a manageable leak goes completely off the rails. At minute 1, water spreads rapidly across the floor, basically just seeking the lowest point. By hour 1, your drywall is acting like a giant sponge, wicking all that moisture upward. It's also soaking deep into subfloors and carpet padding. And by hour 48, that is when fungal growth actually begins. Mold spores need moisture to colonize, and in a warm, dark climate like inside your walls, wet materials are just the perfect breeding ground.
Because that escalation happens so fast, true professionals, they don't measure their initial response times in days or even half days. A 60-minute emergency response is the absolute industry standard. When water is spreading that fast, technicians need to be on site with truck-mounted extraction equipment within that first hour to stop the damage before it quite literally doubles.
All right, Section 3, the 3 categories of water. Not all floods are created equal. Professionals don't just look at a flooded room and see water. They see distinct levels of threat.
Now, what's really interesting about this breakdown is how the industry universally grades water contamination. Category 1 is clean water. This comes from sanitary sources, like a broken supply line. Often, the materials it touches can actually be dried right in place. Category 2 is what's called gray water. Think a dishwasher overflow or a washing machine discharge. It carries some contamination and definitely requires an antimicrobial treatment. Finally, you have Category 3, which is black water. This is grossly contaminated. We're talking sewage backups or river flooding. This demands absolute containment. And porous materials like drywall or carpets, they have to be completely ripped out and safely disposed of. No exceptions.
But here's the really critical vulnerability to understand. These categories,
They aren't static. Even the absolute cleanest Category 1 water from a perfectly sanitary supply line will degrade into contaminated Category 2 water if it just sits there in the building materials for 48 hours. The water literally absorbs dirt, chemicals, and contaminants from the surrounding structure. So dragging your feet on drying turns a totally clean problem into a toxic one.
Which brings us to Section 4, the science of psychrometrics. Moving beyond shop vacs and household fans, we need to look at how the pros actually stop that toxic degradation.
It all revolves around this one term, psychrometrics. It's essentially the study of air and moisture relationships. Certified technicians use this hard science to determine exact drying times and super precise equipment placement. You can't just point a household fan at a wet wall and hope for the best, you know? You have to strategically manipulate temperature, humidity, and airflow to physically force the water out of the building materials.
And a massive part of psychrometrics is calculating something called grain depression. It sounds intense, but it's really just the vital difference between the moisture content in the air and the moisture content locked inside the physical material, like your hardwood floors or your wall studs. True restoration means lowering the humidity in the room so significantly that those wet structural materials are forced to release their trapped moisture into the dry air. And this brilliantly illustrates why DIY drying is so incredibly risky. On the one hand, you have household fans, shop vacs that you have to empty every 10 minutes and, well, pure guesswork. On the other hand, you have true structural drying. We're talking refrigerant dehumidifiers processing thousands of cubic feet of air per minute, thermal imaging cameras to literally see inside the walls, and highly sophisticated moisture mapping. It really is the difference between just masking a problem and scientifically curing it.
Let's look at Section 5, the professional restoration process, methodically curing the crisis. This is where science is actively applied to save a home. When professionals show up, they bring method and order to the chaos. It always follows these steps. Step 1 is emergency extraction, using those massive truck-mounted units to physically remove any standing water. Step 2 is structural drying, which is placing those commercial dehumidifiers and air movers based entirely on those psychrometric calculations we talked about. And step 3 is mold remediation and verification, treating the surfaces and making completely sure the threat is totally gone. And all of this is governed by super strict industry guidelines known as the IICRC S500 standards. This isn't just a cleanup job, it's a highly regulated technological process. It mandates moisture mapping with thermal cameras, so literally nothing is missed. It requires technicians to take physical pin meter readings twice a day to meticulously track the progress. And it utilizes EPA-registered antimicrobials alongside HEPA air scrubbers to capture airborne spores and actually protect your indoor air quality.
And I really want to emphasize this crucial point. The equipment is never, ever removed on an arbitrary schedule. A technician doesn't just look at it and say, yeah, 3 days should do it. Nope. The dehumidifiers and air movers are only pulled from the home when those moisture meters confirm that the framing, the subfloors, and the wall cavities have fully returned to the verified dry standard. Science, not the clock, dictates when the home is truly safe again. So I'm going to leave you with a somewhat terrifying but definitely necessary question to chew on. Is a hidden leak in your home silently ticking toward a 48-hour moisture crisis right now? Aging pipes, a clogged AC drain, maybe a tiny foundation crack. Water is incredibly patient, but as we've learned today, the damage it causes is relentlessly fast. I really hope this explainer has completely changed how you view the walls around you and the hidden science required to keep them standing dry and strong. Thanks for joining me today, and until next time, stay curious.